Mirror Talk episode 26. When words fail, somatic overwhelm, silence, and learning to speak through body cues. Welcome to Mirror Talk, the language of the nervous system. There are moments when the mouth opens, but nothing comes out. Moments when the body remembers something the mind has no language for. When speech, that elegant bridge between thought and world, simply collapses under the weight of what it cannot yet say. The silence that speaks in those moments, silence is not emptiness. It's data. It's the nervous system whispering, this is too much to translate. We often imagine communication as words leaving a mouth and entering an ear, but long before language existed, the body was already fluent. Long before we could form sentences, we spoke through breath, through movement, through the subtle vibrations of proximity and posture. A sigh meant surrender, a turned shoulder meant retreat, a softened gaze meant, I'm safe with you. Even now, after millennia of verbal sophistication, the nervous system still listens to tone before meaning, rhythm before content, presence before precision. In this sense, the body is the first language we ever spoke and the last one we forget. The anatomy of silence. In the field of polyvagal theory, we learn that speech is not an isolated function. It's a delicate choreography between the breath, the diaphragm, the throat, the vagus nerve, and the face. When safety is felt, these systems collaborate like instruments in a symphony, breath flows, tone modulates, eyes sparkle, and gestures animate. But when a threat enters the room, whether real or remembered, the music stops. The vagus nerve, that quiet conductor of safety, pulls the body inward. The throat constricts, air shortens, lips tighten, and gaze narrows. Speech, once fluid, becomes rigid or disappears entirely. This is why trauma survivors often say, I wanted to speak, but I couldn't. It's not a metaphor. It's physiology. The mouth can't articulate safety if the body doesn't feel it. And so silence becomes not the absence of communication, but the body's protest against unsafe expression. It is the nervous system saying, I cannot perform honesty in a context that punishes truth. The language beneath language, every nervous system carries a secret dialect, a way of speaking that bypasses vocabulary. A trembling hand might say what decades of therapy couldn't. A tight jaw might hold an entire childhood. A yawn, a sigh, a flinch. These are all syllables in the body's forgotten grammar. In Mirror Talk, we often speak of NSL, nervous system language, the way tone, rhythm, and breath communicate safety or threat before words arrive. This episode takes that idea even deeper, into the spaces where words fail, and the body becomes both the speaker and the listener. We'll explore the moment of freeze, not as weakness, but as the body's brilliant way of saying, enough. We'll trace how overwhelm turns to muteness, how expression hides beneath composure, and how we can learn to hear the intelligence inside that silence. Because sometimes healing doesn't begin with a sentence. It begins with a shiver, a tremor, a single inhale that finally doesn't have to hide. When the mouth closes, the story changes. For many of us, silence has been both refuge and prison. We learned early that speaking the truth could cost connections. That is to say, what we really felt might provoke anger, withdrawal, or shame. So we adapted, turning our voice into a diplomatic translator, smoothing out rough edges so love wouldn't leave. But the cost was subtle. In protecting our relationships, we began betraying our sensations. We became fluent in suppression. This fluency doesn't vanish in adulthood. It evolves into polite deflection, strategic empathy, and careful phrasing designed not to say too much. It's the reason so many conversations feel rehearsed rather than real, and why, in moments of conflict or intimacy, we freeze, not because we don't care, but because the body still believes speech equals danger. To reawaken the authentic voice, then, we must first learn to listen to silence without panic, to recognize it not as failure, but as the body's pause for recalibration. The physiology of unspoken truth. When we study trauma physiology, we find that unspoken truth leaves residues in the musculature, the throat, the diaphragm, and the gut. Every unvoiced no adds tension to the jaw. Every suppressed scream lodges in the chest. Every apology we didn't owe sits like static behind the sternum. The body becomes an archive of unsent messages, a museum of unfinished conversations. Yet the beauty of the human organism is that expression never dies. It only changes form. The body will always find a way to communicate. A spasm, a headache, a chronic ache, a quiet rebellion disguised as fatigue. In somatic therapy, these signals are invitations, not interruptions. They are the body's attempts to complete the sentence it wasn't allowed to finish. When we learn to listen, to breathe, to respond, we help the body speak itself back into coherence, the sacred pause. So before we begin, I invite you to take a breath, not the shallow kind that only reaches the chest, but the kind that opens the space behind your ribs. Notice the texture of that breath, the way it enters and exits without needing permission. This unhurried inhalation is your body saying, you can stay. Let the breath remind you that speech is not the starting point of communication, but the final expression of safety. Before any word is formed, the nervous system must first ask, am I safe enough to speak? If the answer is no, your body will speak for you, through movement, tension, silence, or collapse. Our work here is not to force words, but to understand the silence, to meet it with curiosity rather than critique, because silence, too, is a kind of language, one that carries the weight of everything we never got to say. The question beneath the quiet throughout this episode, you'll hear echoes of an ancient question, one every nervous system has asked in its own way. How do I stay connected when expression feels unsafe? That question has guided lovers, artists, rebels, and survivors alike. It's the reason poetry exists, to say what can't be said. It's the reason music moves us, because melody can express what syntax cannot. And it's the reason we tremble, because movement speaks truth faster than meaning can. When we view silence through that lens, it stops being a void and becomes a vessel, a place where language goes to be reborn. In this episode, we'll explore the polyvagal pathway of speech, how safety determines articulation, the NSL of nonverbal communication, what the body says when the voice is gone, the trauma roots of muteness, how silence becomes self-protection, the body as translator, completing unfinished expressions through movement and awareness, and finally, how to speak without words, the art of embodied communication and presence. This is not an episode about learning to talk better. It's about learning to listen deeper, to your tone, your breath, your stillness, because even when words abandon us, the body never lies. So, as we descend into the quiet layers of this conversation, remember, language is not a requirement for truth. Stillness is not the absence of life, and silence, the kind that once scared you, might just be the sound of healing. Let's begin. Element 1, the polyvagal pathway of speech. Before words existed, there was tone. Long before a child can name an emotion, they know the difference between warmth and warning in a caregiver's voice. The human nervous system learns sound before sense, rhythm before reason. What we later call language begins as vibration, a sequence of frequencies that the body interprets as either safety or threat. The voice is the barometer of safety. In every conversation, the body is listening to more than the words being said. It's scanning tone, cadence, breath, and rhythm, asking a single question. Am I safe? The polyvagal theory, developed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges, maps how this internal assessment shapes our entire experience of communication. Through the vagus nerve, the body's great connector, our sense of safety or danger flows from the heart and lungs to facial muscles and vocal cords. When the ventral vagal system is active, our physiology signals calm. The breath deepens, facial expression softens, and the laryngeal muscles coordinate to produce fluid, melodic speech. Voice becomes relational, a bridge for connection. But when the body senses threat, the sympathetic system takes over. Speech becomes clipped, shallow, rushed, or sharp. In deeper states of danger, the dorsal vagal system triggers shutdown, constricting the throat and reducing vocal output altogether. To an outside observer, these shifts might look like mood swings or personality changes. In reality, they are expressions of the body's state-dependent language, the nervous system's attempt to maintain survival through sound. Research on vocal prosody supports this. Studies show that subtle changes in pitch and rhythm often reveal emotional state before conscious awareness does. Even infants can detect when their mother's tone signals tension rather than safety. The voice, then, is not merely a messenger of thought, but a live broadcast of physiology. The collapse of speech. For many people, the body's protective silence is not an occasional occurrence but a recurring theme. It can trace back to moments when speech itself felt unsafe. Picture a child surrounded by escalating voices, locked in a cycle of accusation and demand. They try to explain, to reason, but the air around them thickens with pressure. Breath shortens, the throat tightens, and suddenly, nothing comes out. The impulse to communicate is there, yet the body refuses to cooperate. This is not stubbornness or rebellion. It is a neurophysiological shutdown, the dorsal vagal response that prioritizes survival by immobilizing the system. The body, overwhelmed and perceiving no escape, chooses silence as a form of protection. In this frozen state, the muscles of the larynx lose flexibility. The vocal folds stiffen, breath flow becomes minimal. The brain's language centers, Broca's and Wernicke's areas, are disrupted by the flood of stress hormones. The person may appear blank, mute, or withdrawn, while internally they are flooded with unspoken words. This phenomenon began for me in childhood. When others wouldn't stop, I'd try to explain, but my body refused. I'd freeze, and the more I tried to talk, the less sound came out. They'd mock me for acting strange, not realizing it wasn't a choice, it was my body shutting down. This experience illustrates what neuroscientists now recognize as speech inhibition under stress, a survival reflex rather than a psychological failure. The voice doesn't vanish because of weakness, but because the vagus nerve has withdrawn its permission to engage. When this shutdown is met with ridicule or dismissal, the body learns that even its most honest signals will be punished. Over time, silence becomes habitual, not as a preference, but as a conditioned form of safety. The vagus nerve, the bridge between emotion and expression, the vagus nerve, from the Latin for wandering, truly wanders. It travels from the brainstem through the neck, branching into the heart, lungs, gut, and face, forming the biological pathway of connection. Through this single network, the state of the body determines how emotion becomes sound. Porges' research identifies a branch of the vagus called the ventral vagal complex, which governs the muscles of the face and voice. It allows us to express subtle emotion, the microvariations in pitch and rhythm that communicate safety, empathy, or care. When the ventral vagus is active, the muscles that shape vocal tone are relaxed and synchronized with breath. This is why regulated speech sounds warm and rhythmic. In contrast, when the sympathetic system dominates, the voice loses melody, the rhythm quickens. High-frequency energy enters the tone, signaling an alarm to the listener's nervous system. And when the dorsal system takes over, sound itself retreats, volume drops, sentences shorten, and words become mechanical. Voice and emotion are not separate. They are two ends of the same neural thread. When one changes, the other follows. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett describes emotion as the body's interpretation of its own internal signals. In that sense, the voice is the audible expression of interoception, how we perceive our internal state. If the inner landscape feels threatened, the sound will carry tension. If the body feels safe, tone expands into harmony. Even Darwin, in his 1872 book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animal, observed that the human voice evolved not primarily for speech, but for effect. He wrote that the modulation of tone preceded language, and was originally a social cue for reassurance, warning, or invitation. In evolutionary terms, the voice became a survival tool long before it became a vehicle of intellect. Silence as signal. In modern culture, silence is often misinterpreted. We treat it as avoidance, guilt, or non-cooperation, when it is often the final language of protection. Silence is the body's way of saying, I cannot speak safely yet. The problem is that most communication frameworks don't account for nervous system states. In relationships, workplaces, and families, we expect dialogue even when physiology forbids it. When a person freezes, others often escalate, interpreting withdrawal as distance. The result is a feedback loop of misunderstanding. From the lens of NSL, nervous system language, silence is not the end of communication, but a signal that regulation must come first. Breath before word. Safety before syntax. When we listen with the body as well as the ears, we can detect the difference between avoidance and collapse. Avoidance carries energy, eyes dart, muscles tense, and the person prepares to escape. Collapse carries weight, shoulders sink, breath stops, gaze unfocuses. One is defiance, the other is despair. Silence also contains ancestral echo. Across cultures, stillness has been used as a form of healing. In Buddhist and contemplative traditions, silence is not absence but presence, the still point where nervous systems can recalibrate. In trauma recovery, the same principle applies. Speech returns not by force but by safety. A polyvagal-informed perspective reframes the silent person not as a problem to solve, but as a body in need of co-regulation. The task is not to extract words, but to restore safety through tone, presence, and breath. When another's calm nervous system meets our frozen one, the voice begins to thaw. The relearning of voice-reclaiming speech after trauma is not about finding better words. It's about re-establishing the physiological conditions that allow words to exist. The healing process involves teaching the nervous system that expression will no longer lead to danger. Practices such as vocal toning, gentle humming, and breath synchronization stimulate the ventral vagal system. The vibrations produced by humming send mechanical signals through the vagus, encouraging parasympathetic activation. Research by Porges and colleagues has shown that even slow, rhythmic breathing can increase heart rate variability, a key measure of vagal tone, and thereby improve emotional regulation. In somatic therapy, clients are sometimes invited to produce sound without forming words. This bypasses the cognitive pressure of articulation and focuses on restoring flow through the body. Gradually, as the nervous system learns safety, sentences begin to reappear, not because the person forces them, but because the body allows them. Relearning voice is a form of autonomic re-education. It teaches the body that speaking does not equal danger, that expression can exist without repercussion. Over time, the voice evolves from defense into resonance. This process mirrors the early development of speech in infants. A baby learns to vocalize not through correction, but through mirroring. When a caregiver responds warmly to a babble, the baby's nervous system records that sound as safe. The ventral vagal circuit strengthens. Connection becomes encoded as melody. The adult relearning voice is, in many ways, returning to this origin point, rediscovering what it feels like to be heard without fear. In the modern context, where speed and performance dominate, this slow relearning can feel countercultural. Yet it is the foundation of relational repair. Regulated voice is not only communication, it is a nervous system offering safety to another nervous system. When the voice emerges again, it carries something new: steadiness, pacing, a rhythm that honors both self and other. The tone no longer fights for space, but makes space. Reflection prompt. When my voice changes, what is my body trying to say before my words arrive? Language does not begin in the mouth, it begins in the body. Every gesture, posture, and breath continues the conversation our nervous system is already having. In the next element, we will explore how the body itself speaks, through rhythm, micro-expression, and motion. This is where the grammar of presence begins, and where silence turns back into communication. Element 2, the nervous system language of expression. The body as the first grammar before language becomes words. It becomes movement. The body speaks in signals, the turn of a shoulder, the rise of a breath, the softening of eyes. Every gesture, whether conscious or unconscious, is an act of communication between the inner world and the outer. The concept of nervous system language, NSL, recognizes this, that beneath the linguistic layer of human communication lies a physiological dialogue, one that precedes and shapes every word we say. Each of us carries a kind of somatic syntax, built from our earliest relational experiences. When a caregiver coos softly, the baby's heartbeat slows. When that same caregiver yells, the child's diaphragm tightens, the stomach contracts, and the muscles of the neck pull taut. These bodily reactions form the child's first dictionary of meaning. Soft equals safe, sharp equals threat. Before we can ever read a book or form a sentence, we are fluent in the grammar of tone, proximity, and presence. The nervous system does not wait for words to decide what to feel. It reads rhythm and resonance, then shapes behavior around them. This is why the NSL framework begins with physiology, not philosophy. The body itself is language, breathing, pulsing, vibrating with messages about connection and protection. When the body feels safe, it moves and sounds in ways that invite reciprocity. When it feels unsafe, it contracts and guards. The polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, explains that our autonomic state determines how we express ourselves. When the ventral vagal system is active, our faces become expressive, our tones melodic, our breathing synchronized with others. This is the biological foundation of social connection, what Porges calls the social engagement system. But when the sympathetic system takes over, the body prepares for fight or flight. Speech accelerates, gestures sharpen, tone becomes urgent. And under the dorsal vagal system, the body shuts down altogether, the nervous system retreats, muscles lose tone, and voice becomes faint or absent. Every state has its dialect. The ventral voice speaks in openness, the sympathetic in urgency, the dorsal in withdrawal. In this way, the body's language forms a map of our emotional history. Every learned survival pattern has its own syntax. Every muscle remembers a sentence it once had to hold. Mirror neurons and the biology of resonance. In the early 1990s, researchers led by Giacomo Rizzolatti at the University of Parma discovered that certain neurons in macaque monkeys fired not only when the animal acted, but also when it observed another doing the same. These were called mirror neurons, and their discovery transformed our understanding of empathy and social behavior. In humans, mirror neurons activate in similar ways. When we watch someone smile, frown, or move, our brain partially simulates that action. This neural mirroring forms the biological basis of empathy. We literally feel others through imitation. From the NSL and MLH, Mirror-Linguistic Hypothesis perspective, this means language is not only about communication, but also co-regulation. The nervous system continuously mirrors tone, rhythm, and gesture to maintain synchrony with others. When two people converse, their heart rates subtly align. Their breathing patterns begin to match. Even their micro-expressions synchronize. Studies using hyperscanning fMRI show that during meaningful dialogue, participants' neural activity becomes rhythmically coupled, a phenomenon known as interbrain synchrony. This synchrony is what makes conversation more than an exchange of data. It's an energetic attunement. The tone of one person's voice can either calm or destabilize another's entire body. This explains why a kind word said with tension can feel unsafe, or a direct truth said with warmth can feel liberating. The nervous system listens to tone before meaning. In this sense, empathy is not purely psychological, it's physiological. The body doesn't just interpret another's state, it recreates it. The nervous system is both transmitter and receiver, constantly broadcasting and receiving the frequencies of safety or threat. When language and physiology align, we feel coherence, the sense that what is being said matches what is being felt. But when they diverge, we experience discomfort or mistrust. This is linguistic incongruence, the dissonance between verbal and non-verbal communication. For those raised in inconsistent or manipulative environments, this dissonance can become internalized. They learn to mistrust their instincts, to privilege spoken words over bodily signals. Healing requires the reverse, learning once again to let the body's truth lead. Movement as meaning. Every culture has gestures, shared, silent words that carry social significance. But beyond cultural meaning, gestures are the body's direct translation of emotion into motion. A raised hand can mean stop, but it can also mean stay back, or even I'm afraid. Context comes from the nervous system state. When the sympathetic system dominates, movements become angular and abrupt. Under ventral engagement, movements are circular, flowing, and rhythmic. Movement itself is a language. It is the physical manifestation of emotional syntax, what the NSL calls embodied grammar. Neuroscientific studies support this link. In 2008, researchers at the University of Chicago found that restricting hand movement during speech impaired verbal fluency. When people gestured freely, their ideas flowed more coherently. This indicates that speech and gesture share neural pathways, specifically involving Broca's area, which governs both motor planning and language. To silence movement, then, is to constrict language. This is why trauma survivors often describe feeling frozen. Their bodies, conditioned to minimize threat, limit movement, and by extension, expression. When the body cannot move freely, the voice often follows suit. Shallow breathing, tight diaphragms, and tense throats disrupt not only tone but emotional expression. The body's frozen syntax translates into halting speech. Conversely, somatic therapies that restore rhythm through dance, breathwork, or shaking often restore language. Words begin to flow once the body rediscovers motion. Emotion, as neuroscientist Antonio Damasio writes, is the body's interpretation of its own internal changes. To move is to let the body narrate that interpretation in real time. When movement resumes, meaning resumes, the symbolic syntax of stillness is often misread as silence, yet it's one of the body's most eloquent languages. In a world addicted to speed and noise, stillness can feel like disobedience. But in the language of the nervous system, stillness is punctuation, the pause that allows integration. In trauma recovery, stillness represents a nervous system reclaiming control over tempo. It's the moment between stimulus and response where awareness returns. Yet for many, stillness feels dangerous. Those raised in volatile homes associate quiet with punishment, withdrawal, or rejection. The nervous system, conditioned by unpredictability, mistakes calm for absence. Stillness is not the absence of movement, it's contained movement. It's the nervous system holding presence without collapse. In this sense, stillness is the highest form of expression, the point where energy no longer needs to prove itself. From the MLH perspective, stillness is the unspoken syllable of safety. It signals to the body, nothing needs fixing right now. When that message lands, the breath deepens and the muscles release their vigilance. Cultural linguistics supports this. In Japanese, pauses in conversation, are revered as spaces for resonance. In Western speech, however, pauses are often interrupted, filled with filler words or apologies. These cultural patterns reveal collective nervous system tendencies, societies either honoring or avoiding stillness. When we reintroduce stillness into our communication, we teach our bodies that safety does not depend on constant explanation. The nervous system learns that being can speak louder than doing. The somatic observation practice. To translate the body's language, one must learn to listen to sensation before interpretation. The somatic observation practice offers a way to do this. Find a space where you can sit or stand comfortably. Let your awareness settle into your body without trying to change anything. Then recall a recent experience that left you unable to speak or express yourself clearly. Watch without judgment what your body does as the memory arises. Does your jaw tighten? Does your chest lift or sink? Do your eyes want to close or look away? Each of these is a word in your nervous system's vocabulary. Now recall a moment of genuine connection or safety, someone's calm voice, a gesture of understanding, a memory of laughter. Observe again. The breath deepens, shoulders open. The body expands into its natural rhythm. The difference between these two states is the body's alphabet, a living lexicon of survival and belonging. By practicing observation regularly, you begin to recognize your internal dialect. You'll notice that your body speaks in patterns. A tightening before conflict, a collapse after shame, a flutter in the stomach when intuition awakens. This awareness builds what psychologists call interoceptive accuracy, the ability to sense and interpret internal bodily signals. Research from Sarah Garfinkel and Hugo Critchley, 2016, shows that interoceptive accuracy is directly linked to emotional regulation and empathy. The more accurately we feel our own states, the more attuned we become to others. Over time, this practice rewires communication. You begin to pause before reacting, to check the body's translation before the mind's assumption. This pause is the foundation of self-regulation and authentic dialogue. The body as translator. If language is the architecture of thought, then the body is its translator. Every emotion must pass through physiology before it becomes speech. When that translation is clear, communication feels effortless. When it's blocked, words become tangled, hollow, or defensive. The goal of NSL and MLH is not to replace language but to reconnect it to its roots, to restore meaning to tone and truth to presence. When we listen not only to what someone says, but how their body says it, communication shifts from performance to communion. This is the deeper purpose of embodied expression, not to persuade, but to harmonize. And perhaps this is what the nervous system has been teaching all along. That understanding doesn't begin in the intellect, but in the rhythm of shared breath. Reflection prompt. Notice where your body speaks the loudest when your words go quiet. What is it trying to tell you that your mind cannot yet translate? Every nervous system has a story. Some were taught to speak, others were taught to stay silent. For many, silence became a kind of safety, a shield against punishment, ridicule, or loss. But that protection, carried into adulthood, can become a prison. In the next element, we'll explore the survival roots of silence, how speech inhibition, shame conditioning, and chronic threat rewire the voice itself. We'll meet the physiology of muted truth, where the body still whispers what the mind was once forbidden to say. Element 3, trauma, and the physiology of muted truth. There is a certain kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It isn't the kind of quiet that holds safety or pause. It's the silence that arrives when every attempt to speak feels like walking barefoot across broken glass, when your body decides, long before your mind can intervene, that words are dangerous. This is not a metaphor, it's biology, the protective architecture of silence. When we think of communication, we imagine words, sentences built from thought. But from a neurobiological perspective, speech is the last layer of communication, not the first. Beneath every phrase is a set of bodily negotiations: breath, vagal tone, heart rhythm, and the coordination between the diaphragm and larynx. If those systems sense a threat, the voice withdraws before the person even realizes what's happening. Polyvagal theory helps decode this moment. In a safe connection, the ventral vagal system, the branch of the parasympathetic network responsible for social engagement, allows the muscles of the face and throat to move fluidly. The tone is warm, the breath easy, but under threat, the body shifts into defense. If fight or flight aren't possible, it collapses into dorsal vagal shutdown, a freeze response designed to minimize danger through invisibility. The voice literally loses access to its social pathways. Words vanish not because you're unwilling to speak, but because your nervous system has already chosen silence as survival. The cultural misreading of collapse, in a society that prizes verbal fluency as proof of competence or control, this biological silence is often mistaken for manipulation, defiance, or immaturity. Children who freeze are labeled uncooperative. Adults who go quiet in conflict are called passive-aggressive or stonewalling. Yet these judgments erase the body's wisdom. Silence can be an act of self-preservation when speech feels like exposure. A child whose early attempts to express fear or confusion were met with ridicule or punishment learns that speech equals danger. Over time, the body codes silence as safety. It becomes not just a habit, but a neural reflex, a learned pause written into the tissues of the throat and diaphragm. A lived illustration. There are countless variations of this story, but one echoes the universal pattern. Imagine a child trying to explain why they are upset, maybe because they've been provoked, mocked, or simply overwhelmed. They attempt to speak, but the words fragment. The body floods. The breath shortens, the throat tightens, eyes blur. The nervous system hijacks the very mechanism of expression. Instead of finding release, they find shutdown. And as they stutter or fall silent, the others, confused or impatient, interpret this as refusal or irrationality. Some even mock the struggle, deepening the collapse. In such moments, the child isn't choosing silence. They are being silenced by their own biology, a reflexive response to perceived threat. The voice doesn't vanish out of weakness, but because the nervous system is doing its job, preventing further harm. Without the tools or language to decode what's happening, the experience becomes internalized as shame. The silence becomes a story. I'm too much. I can't handle it. I'm broken. But the truth is the opposite. The body was protecting itself with precision. It was saying, I'm overwhelmed, and I don't have safety yet. The science of speech inhibition, modern neuropsychology, confirms what trauma survivors have always felt intuitively. The link between the vagus nerve, respiration, and vocalization is direct. When the vagal brake is activated under perceived threat, airflow constricts, and the laryngeal muscles tighten. The same physiological reflex that slows the heart rate also muffles the voice. Research on alexithymia, the inability to identify or describe emotion, often traces back to this disconnection between affective experience and verbal articulation. In such states, the body carries the weight of words that never had a safe listener. Studies using fMRI imaging, see Van der Kolk 2014, Porges 2011, reveal that Broca's area, the brain's speech center, can go offline during acute stress. When trauma is reactivated, language shuts down because the prefrontal cortex, responsible for organized thought, temporarily loses access to subcortical emotion. The result is exactly what survivors describe. I knew what I wanted to say, but nothing came out. Shame, mockery, and the social punishment of silence cultural environments often reinforce the trauma by punishing its expression. Silence is labeled weakness. Tears are deemed manipulation. Visible overwhelm becomes social failure. And so the body learns to compress the unsaid into muscle tension, digestive constriction, migraines, insomnia, the alphabet of repression. The tragedy of this dynamic is that it transforms the survival mechanism into self-criticism. The person internalizes the external voice of judgment. The body's honest response, "I can't speak because I don't feel safe," becomes twisted into "I'm pathetic for not being able to speak." That distortion is what trauma scholar Judith Herman called the colonization of the inner voice. What was once a reflex for safety becomes a weapon of shame turned inward, from physiological defense to emotional identity. When silence becomes chronic, it reshapes identity. People begin to describe themselves as quiet, non-confrontational, or bad with words. But often, beneath those self-definitions lies an unhealed pattern. The nervous system still equates speech with danger. The paradox is that what began as an intelligent adaptation becomes an emotional cage. The same reflex that once saved the child now limits the adult's capacity for intimacy. Every conversation that carries emotional charge risks reactivating the same physiological freeze. The body does not know time. It only knows safety or threat. So when you lose your words in the middle of a conflict, it isn't immaturity, it's the body remembering. Somatic awareness. The first step to reclaiming voice healing begins when silence is no longer seen as failure, but as communication from the body. The invitation isn't to force words through a tight throat, but to listen to what the silence is saying. When the nervous system constricts speech, it's asking for regulation, not reprimand. Safety must come before sound. Simple grounding, breathing low into the belly, feeling the support of the chair, widening the gaze can begin to restore enough parasympathetic tone for language to reappear. The goal is not eloquence, but presence. Because before you can speak your truth, your body must first believe it's safe to exist. Element 3. Trauma and the physiology of muted truth, the echoes of unspoken stories. When silence becomes a language of its own, the body becomes the archive. Every unsaid word leaves an imprint, not as memory alone, but as muscular residue, respiratory rhythm, and subtle contraction. What the voice cannot release, the fascia remembers. And what the mind represses, the nervous system continues to whisper through sensation. This is the paradox of trauma. It hides in plain sight, in the breath we hold without noticing, in the way we swallow words, in the tension that shapes the tone we never get to express. The science of stuck expression, Bessel van der Kolk, in The Body Keeps the Score, describes the voice as an emotional muscle. When a threat becomes chronic, that muscle stiffens, not just metaphorically, but structurally. The vocal cords are part of the same cranial nerve system that controls heart rate and digestion. When you feel fear or shame, the vagus nerve redirects blood flow, tightens the throat, and alters breathing patterns. This isn't random. It's the body trying to minimize output until safety is restored. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory reframes speech not as a purely mental act, but as a social cue of trust. When your tone softens, your breath synchronizes, and your eyes relax, you're signaling the ventral vagal state. But if your system perceives danger, even subconsciously, your voice lowers, flattens, or disappears. It's an automatic lockdown, a protective silence that says, "I can't risk connection until I know I'm safe." And in those moments, speech inhibition isn't a symptom of weakness. It's an act of bodily wisdom, a temporary retreat that protects the psyche from fragmentation. The nervous system logic of inarticulation. For those who grew up in unpredictable or high-intensity environments, this reflex becomes chronic. The body internalizes a double command. Speak so they understand you, but stay quiet so you don't get hurt. It's a contradiction that the nervous system can't resolve. So it oscillates, blurting and freezing, apologizing and shutting down, the pendulum swing of trauma trying to negotiate between expression and safety. Research on vagal tone shows that individuals with a history of emotional neglect often exhibit delayed recovery after stress exposure. Their vocal and respiratory systems take longer to return to baseline. What this means is that even after the danger is gone, the body still behaves as if it's unsafe to speak. The body doesn't trust that it won't be punished for honesty. Silence has inherited survival. This silence is rarely isolated. It's passed through families like a nervous inheritance. Parents who grew up in homes where speaking truth led to rejection often teach their children, without words, to stay quiet, to smooth things over, to avoid conflict at any cost. The result is a lineage of suppressed expression, generations of throats that tighten at the edge of authenticity. Transgenerational trauma research supports this. Children of trauma survivors often exhibit physiological hypervigilance and voice suppression patterns even without direct exposure to violence. Language becomes coded with fear. Even simple phrases, "Don't talk back," "Keep your voice down," "We don't say things like that," transmit the message that safety depends on silence. These linguistic imprints shape identity. They create adults who apologize for their tone, soften their truth, or mask discomfort with humor. And though society might praise them as kind or easygoing, the cost is immense. The nervous system never learns that safety can coexist with honesty. When the voice breaks before the words, the human voice doesn't just carry sound, it carries story. It trembles not only when we're afraid, but when we approach the edges of what has never been spoken before. Voice coaches and trauma therapists alike describe moments when a client's pitch falters mid-sentence, not because of stage fright, but because their body is re-encountering unintegrated experience. This is often when people describe feeling like they're speaking through a wall. It isn't a metaphorical wall, it's a physiological one. The diaphragm locks, the throat constricts, and the temporal lobe, where speech comprehension resides, becomes flooded with emotion. The person can feel the truth they want to express, but can't shape it into language. Van der Kolk calls this speechless terror. It's the moment when the body remembers faster than the mind can translate. Reclaiming speech through awareness, to rebuild trust between voice and body, the process must begin beneath language. You can't talk your way out of a freeze response. You have to regulate your way through it. This is where somatic awareness and gentle exposure meet. A simple exercise. Sit in quiet, place a hand on your throat, and say nothing. Feel the pulse under your fingertips. Notice any tension, tremor, or hollowness. Then, imagine the phrase you could never say, and don't speak it aloud. Just breathe it. The goal isn't confession. It's permission for the body to remember that sound and safety can coexist. Over time, as parasympathetic tone rebuilds, the voice returns on its own, not as a performance, but as a reunion. From survival to expression, the repatterning process healing the physiology of silence is not about forcing speech, but about restoring coherence. When the voice, breath, and heartbeat begin to move in synchrony again, words no longer feel like weapons. They become instruments of integration. That's what trauma recovery really is, learning to make sound without fear. As regulation deepens, the silence itself changes character. It's no longer a void of shame, but a space of listening. The same quiet that once felt suffocating becomes sacred, a pause that allows the body to catch up with the soul. And this shift, from suppressed silence to sacred silence, is the hinge between this element and the next. Because before the body can speak truth through words, it must first remember how to speak through movement. When the body is finally allowed to finish what the voice could not, the message changes shape. Meaning stops depending on eloquence and starts resting on coherence. Breath that doesn't rush, shoulders that don't brace, eyes that don't flinch. From here, our task is not to add more words, but to organize presence, to speak in a grammar made of air, gaze, and small, honest gestures. Next, we gather NSL and MLH into a single, workable ritual. Breathe, sense signal, stay. This is how we repair when language falters. This is how we let our bodies converse and be understood. Element 5, integration practice and closing whisper. Speaking without words, by the time most of us reach adulthood, we've learned thousands of words yet forgotten the first language we ever spoke, the one made of breath, gaze, and gesture. Infants speak it fluently, a widening of the eyes to invite, a reaching of arms to connect, a wrinkled brow to protest. Long before vocabulary, we converse through nervous system rhythms, the return to embodied literacy. This first language never disappears, it only gets buried under social performance. Every conversation since childhood has layered conditioning over instinct. Be polite, be composed, be reasonable. In the process, we mistake fluency for honesty. We become eloquent about everything except our own regulation. Reclaiming the language beneath words is not regression, it's remembrance. It's recognizing that communication didn't begin with articulation, it began with attunement. And when we lose words in overwhelm, the body isn't failing us, it's reverting to its native tongue. In NSL, nervous system language terms, this is communication at parasympathetic depth, signals traded between bodies faster than thought. In MLH, Mirror-Linguistic Hypothesis terms, it's the substrate of meaning. Every phrase rides on posture, tone, and tempo, whether we notice it or not. When we integrate these frameworks, we don't reject language, we refine it. Speech becomes an echo of embodied coherence, not a substitute for it. Breath as the architecture of meaning. Breath is the punctuation of emotion. Every inhale begins a clause, every exhale completes it. When we speak in a rush, we aren't only betraying anxiety, we're depriving our sentences of oxygen and our listeners of trust. A single regulated exhale recalibrates both the speaker and the space between nervous systems. Polyvagal research shows that extending the out-breath stimulates the ventral branch of the vagus nerve, the same pathway that supports social engagement and facial expressivity. This means that the physiological act of breathing differently is already communication. It tells your own system we are safe enough to connect. So before you answer, negotiate, or apologize, breathe. One intentional inhale, one slow, audible exhale. Let that be the comma that separates reaction from response. Sense, locating the message beneath the muscle. Once breath steadies, awareness widens. To sense is to translate somatic sensation into relational data. Where is contraction? Where is ease? Which direction does the body lean toward? Forward in curiosity, back in caution. These are not metaphors. They are micro-movements the nervous system performs automatically. By learning to feel them in real time, you begin editing the conversation before it fractures. A tightening in the jaw, That's the sentence you're about to swallow. A hollowing in the chest? That's turning to performance. Warmth behind the eyes? That's the truth preparing to surface. Sensing doesn't require analysis, it requires patience. Hold awareness like you'd hold a trembling animal, steady, unjudging, present long enough for it to trust you. From that trust, translation begins. Signal. The honest minimalism of gesture to signal is to let the body speak deliberately without defaulting to words. It's not acting, it's aligning. Every human nervous system recognizes these ancient cues. Palm out, boundary, palm up, invitation. Hand to heart, ownership. Soft nod, continuity. Steady gaze, softened jaw, presence. Each carries a rhythm your listener's body will mirror before their intellect interprets. This is why a small nod can de-escalate an argument faster than 1,000 explanations. When you pair clear signals with coherent breath, you become legible again, not merely understood, but felt. Legibility is safety's twin. When others can read you accurately, their own systems settle and dialogue becomes possible. Stay. The courage to leave space unfilled. The hardest part of the ritual is the simplest word, stay. To stay is to resist the reflex to explain, fix, or rescue the moment. It is the nervous system equivalent of holding eye contact with the truth. When you stay, silence transforms from threat to container. Think of the pause after a deep exhale as a doorway. On one side, performance. On the other hand, present. That small space, a second, maybe two, is where meaning lands. It's also where mutual regulation begins. Every dialogue that heals includes a stay, a shared quiet where both systems confirm. We survived that moment without abandoning ourselves. Applied embodied communication. Let's ground this ritual in scenarios drawn from real emotional life, the everyday theatre where words are clumsy and bodies do the talking. A. The hand over heart apology. When guilt knots the throat, the body can deliver sincerity that words cannot. Place a palm over your chest, feel the warmth of skin meeting heartbeat. Drop the shoulders, release a breath through the mouth, and look toward the other person without chasing their eyes. If speech arrives, let it be short. I see it. If it doesn't, stay until your breath and theirs fall into the same tempo. This rhythm is the apology, remorse, regulated by respect. B. The exhale boundary. Your mid-conversation, tone escalating. Rather than a rebuttal, exhale through the nose, slow enough that the shoulders visibly drop. Raise one relaxed palm at chest height, fingers uncurling rather than stiffening. Softly, pause. The physiology says the rest. You've asserted space without threat. The exhale makes the word credible. C. The eye contact consent. When the connection feels tentative, nod once and let the gaze return gently after a blink. In polyvagal terms, this micro-rhythm signals ventral availability. I'm here, not cornered. Consent, in its truest form, begins as shared regulation long before verbal agreement. D. The stillness of repair after rupture. Don't rush to narrative. Sit or stand with both feet grounded, hands open, breath slow, eyes level with the others. Let quietness do what speech cannot. Remind both bodies that continuity exists. Only once safety returns should the story be retold. Each of these scenes rewrites the assumption that communication equals words. They return dialogue to its biological roots, synchrony, resonance, and pacing. The neuroscience of wordless dialogue contemporary research offers validation for what mystics and therapists alike have long known. Regulation is relational. Dr. Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory shows that facial expression, prosody, and posture form a feedback loop between the vagus nerve and heart rhythm. When one system calms, the other detects and mirrors that calm. All this happens below conscious awareness, a living subtext that predates language by millennia. Mirror neuron studies, Rizzolatti et al. 1996 onwards, demonstrate that observing another's movement activates the same neural circuits used to perform that movement. This is empathy at its most literal. Our brains rehearse each other's gestures. It explains why a single unclenched hand can disarm tension across a room. The body perceives coherence and copies it. When we train ourselves to inhabit coherence deliberately through breath, gesture, and pacing, we become tuning forks for safety. Speech that follows this embodied. Coherence naturally simplifies. Words shrink to their essence because the rest of the message is already delivered. Reflection practice. Find a quiet space. No goal, no script. Breathe once, fully. Then ask inwardly, how does my present speak when language fails me? Notice the first impulse, perhaps a breath, a shift, a tear, a micro-movement of the jaw. That is your answer. Repeat the question at different moments in the week. During tension, during joy, during boredom. Watch how the body's grammar changes with context. Awareness alone begins the translation. Closing whisper, the quiet that speaks for itself. Some silences punish and silences heal. The first withholds, the second witnesses. When you practice the ritual long enough, you begin to recognize the difference by feeling alone. In a world addicted to explanation, wordless understanding feels almost rebellious. But rebellion is not the goal. Coherence is. To speak without words is not to abandon intellect, but to remind it who taught it to mean in the first place. The body remains the oldest author of truth. Let this be your integration. When conversation spirals, return to breath. When confusion floods, sense before you speak. When emotion spikes, signal instead of scatter. And when the urge to justify rises, stay. Stay until stillness becomes syntax, until quiet carries the meaning, until presence is enough. Thank you for walking through this deep terrain where voice meets vibration. In practicing breathe, sense, signal, stay, you're not just learning a technique, you're remembering how the nervous system wrote language long before the mouth joined in. Carry this ritual into small daily exchanges, greetings, apologies, moments of hesitation. Each repetition rewires the body's default grammar from defense to dialogue. Next time, in episode 27, Cultural Mirrors, Language and Identity, balancing authenticity with belonging will widen the focus from the individual body to the collective. We'll ask how entire cultures teach or distort our communication instincts, how accent, idiom, and social script shape who we're allowed to be. If When Words Fail explores silence within the self, Cultural Mirrors will explore how the community either amplifies or mutes that self once it dares to speak. Until then, speak less, breathe more, let your presence finish the sentence your words can't carry. You've been listening to Mirror Talk, the language of the nervous systems. I'm James Miller.